Hello, I'm Dr. Q. Welcome to my channel. This is the 8th class of Principles of Economics. In this video, I will cover market equilibrium. You will learn how to use the demand and supply model to solve for equilibrium market price and quantity, and apply the demand and supply model to estimate how shifts in demand and/or supply affect equilibrium price and quantity. There are plenty of materials and a lot of analysis with graphical expressions. I try to make the graphical expression interactive. Please bear with me. In last class, lecture 7, I used the United States core market data to cover supply. We know that the price and the quantity willing and able to be supplied by producers or sellers move to the same direction. As price goes up, quantity supply goes up as well. While price decreases, the amount supplied also declines. That's a law of supply. In lecture 6, we used Snecker's bars game to derive demand curve, knowing that demand curve is downward sloping, showing that price and the quantity demanded move to the opposite direction. I'm here to use core market demand data to derive the demand curve to make information from both sides consistent. We finished the discussion of demand and supply separately. Now, the two sides of the market finally got to meet each other, and here we are. The intersection or crossing point of the supply and demand curves defines the market equilibrium, which provides us the market equilibrium price $3 and the market equilibrium quantity 13 billion bushels. We use P subscription E and Q subscription E as abbreviations respectively. E is the initial for equilibrium. We can see that at equilibrium price, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. The amount can be afforded and willing to be bought by consumers happen to be equal to the amount can be and willing to be supplied by suppliers. There are no goods piled up and sold, and there are no people who want to and able to buy but cannot get one. In that sense, market equilibrium is also called market clearing point. There are two clarifications I like to make here. First of all, in general, the equilibrium is not achieved overnight. It takes a while for the consumers and the suppliers to interact and figure out the equilibrium. For example, if at first suppliers predict the market incorrectly and set their price at $3.50. At this price, we can find the amount the suppliers want to sell on supply curve, 14 billion bushels, and the quantity consumers are willing and able to afford can be found on demand curve, 12 billion bushels. We can see that the amount purchased by consumers are smaller than the amount supplied by sellers. There is a gap called surplus. And the surplus is equal to 2 billion bushels. The surplus means that there are a couple of billions bushels of corn piling there and sold. Farmers say, that's not good. I like lower my price to sell more, so they drop the price to, for example, $2. At such a low price, a lot of consumers are willing and able to buy, but the amount producers is willing to sell is low. So the quantity demanded is much higher than the quantity supplied. This gap is called shortage. The shortage is equal to 4 billion bushels. Then the sellers realize that the corns are sold super fast. They cannot keep up with the order. They'd better push the price up a little bit. To where? Hopefully, they eventually figure out the market clearing or equilibrium price $3, so that quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, no surplus, and no shortage. Generally speaking, demand and supply force the market to move towards equilibrium price, and once the market is at equilibrium, there is no tendency for price to change. But later we'll learn that the market is dynamic, so there are new equilibrium for the market to adjust to achieve. Secondly, if the market is at its equilibrium or clearing point, it does not mean everyone's desire is satisfied. There are still consumers who want to buy corn at a price lower than $3 but cannot afford $3. So they don't get the corn they desire. There are still producers who want to sell their corn higher than $3 but couldn't find buyers willing to pay more than $3. So those producers have their corn unsold. There are plenty of fancy goods and services at their equilibrium but insanely high price. Remember, wants are unlimited, while means to satisfy the wants are scarce. That's why we have economics. The demand and supply curves look like a pair of scissors. The joint is the equilibrium. The market system helps the society to achieve efficiency. The competitive market generates allocative efficiency as it produces the right mix of goods and services that are most valued by the consumers. The marginal benefit of the last unit of good or service to consumers equals the marginal cost of production. Allocative efficiency requires productive efficiency, which means producers have to produce in the least costly way. If rival firms are producing at $3 per unit, and one is producing at $3.50 per unit, assuming all features of products are identical, then the producer bearing higher cost will not be profitable and can hardly survive. This makes the producers use the right technology and economic resources in right combination to minimize the cost. So far, we have discussed how demand and supply forces interact with one another on market to discover the equilibrium price. Does it mean that once we are at equilibrium, we are settled for good? Surely not. In real world, market is dynamic, which means because of demand shifters, demand changes all the time, so does supply. In some volatile market, the price and quantity actually are hardly at equilibrium, because the equilibrium is changing all the time and the market has something new to adjust to. A quick review of Lecture 6. We learned that those are the determinants of demand. If the determinant changes, the demand relationship, demand curves, shifts to a different location. Now, this is a list of demand shifters that increase demand. If the market is at its equilibrium, and one or some of these things happen, resulting in an increase in demand and shift demand curves to the right-hand side, how will the market react? Let's look at the graphical expression for analysis. We know originally the equilibrium price is $3. Market now does not have tendency to move away from this equilibrium. Now, because the determinant increases the demand curve shifts right-hand side. Supply does not change. At the price of $3, the quantity supplied by producers can be found on supply curve. It's still 13 billion bushels. But the quantity demanded changes now. At the price of $3, the quantity demanded has to be found at a new demand curve, which is 15. The quantity wanted to be and able to be purchased by consumers, 15, is higher than the amount willing to be supplied by sellers, 13. This gap is shortage, and it equals 2 billion bushels. The shortage sends sellers signal to increase the price to clear the market, because higher price will discourage some of the consumers from buying and encourage some producers to sell, so that the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied eventually merge. And the price gradually is discovered at new equilibrium level. So is the quantity. The market achieves new equilibrium. Compared with the original equilibrium, new equilibrium has higher price and higher quantity. Therefore, we can get a conclusion that demand increases, price and quantity increases. On the other hand, if one of these determinants results in decrease in demand shifts left-hand side, supply does not change. At price of $3, the quantity supplied by producers can be found on supply curve. It's still 13 billion bushels, but the quantity demanded changes now. At the price of $3, the quantity demanded has to be found at a new demand curve, which is 11. The quantity wanted to be and able to be purchased by consumers, 11, is smaller than the amount willing to be supplied by sellers, 13. This gap is a surplus, and it equals 2 billion bushels. The surplus sends seller signals to decrease the price to clear the market, because lower price will encourage some of the consumers to buy and discourage some producers from selling, so that the quantity demanded and quantity supplied eventually merge. And the price gradually is discovered at a new equilibrium level. So is the quantity. The market achieves new equilibrium. Compared with the original equilibrium, new equilibrium has lower price and lower quantity. Therefore, we can get a conclusion that demand decreases, price and quantity decrease. So far, we discussed the situation that when demand changes and the supply stays constant, how the market equilibrium changes. Now, let's move on to the situation that when supply changes and demand stays the same. In Lecture 7, we learned the determinants of supply. Here's a review of the list of supply shifters. If the market is at its equilibrium and one or some of these things happen, resulting in an increase in supply and shift supply curve to the right-hand side, how would the market react? Let's look at the graphical expression for analysis. We know originally we're at equilibrium price $3. Market now does not have tendency to move away from this equilibrium. Now, because the determinant increases the supply, supply curve shifts right-hand side, while demand does not change. At price of $3, the quantity demanded by consumers can be found on demand curve. It's still 13 billion bushels. But the quantity supplied changes now. At the price of $3, the quantity supplied has to be found at the new supply curve, which is 15. The quantity wanted to be and able to be purchased by consumers 13 is lower than the amount willing to be supplied by sellers 15. This gap is a surplus, and it equals 2 billion bushels. The surplus sends seller signals to decrease the price to clear the market, because lower price will encourage consumers to buy and discourage some producers from selling, so that quantity demanded and quantity supplied eventually merge. And price gradually is discovered at new equilibrium level, so is quantity. The market achieves new equilibrium. Compared with the original equilibrium, new equilibrium has lower price and higher quantity. Therefore, we can get a conclusion that supply increases, price decreases, and quantity increases. On the other hand, if one or some of these determinants result in decrease in supply, supply shifts left-hand side, demand does not change. At the price of $3, the quantity demanded by consumers can be found on demand curve is still 13 billion bushels, but the quantity supplied changes. At the price of $3, quantity supplied has to be found at the new supply curve, which is 11. The quantity wanted to be and able to be purchased by consumers 13 is larger than the amount willing to be supplied by sellers 11. This gap is a shortage, and it equals 2 billion bushels. The shortage sends sellers signal to increase the price to clear the market, because higher price will discourage some of the consumers from buying and encourage some producers to sell, so that the quantity demanded and quantity supplied eventually merge. And the price gradually is discovered at new equilibrium level, so is quantity. The market achieves new equilibrium. Compared with the original equilibrium, new equilibrium has a higher price and lower quantity. Therefore, we can get the conclusion that supply decreases, price increases, and quantity decreases. Please note that we're here to focus on the quality of the change, which means the direction of the change. Is it increase or decrease? Not the quantity or magnitude of the change. We haven't yet discussed it changes by how much. What if both demand and supply change at the same time? How will the equilibrium change then? This topic won't be the focus of the lecture, as it is complicated and it requires knowledge about elasticity, which I will cover later. But I will provide you graphical expression to grasp the intuition. The consequence of change in both demand and supply simultaneously depends on the elasticity of demand and supply and the magnitude of the change. For example, if both demand and supply increase, there are a pair of demand and supply curves. The one on the left has a flatter demand curve, while the demand curve on the right is steeper. Let's focus on the left one first. If original demand does not hold anymore, instead it increases and moves to the right-hand side, the supply curve does the same. Compared with the original equilibrium, we can say that new equilibrium price and quantity will move to a new level. In particular, both the price and quantity increase. Now, look at the graphical expression on the right. If we do the same, making demand curve and supply curve moves right-hand side. Compared with the original equilibrium, we can say that new equilibrium price and quantity all move to new level. In particular, price decreases and quantity increases. We can say that quantity increase in both cases, while price increase on the left, decreases on the right. Therefore, the conclusion is that when demand and supply increase, we're sure that equilibrium quantity increases. But it's hard to determine how price change. It may increase, it may decrease, and it may stay the same. More information is needed to make a conclusion, and I will not cover in the video. Now, let me provide you the graphical expression and conclusion of the other three complex situations. When both demand and supply decrease. When demand increase and supply decrease. When demand decrease and supply increase. Now let's do a few practice. Let's pause and come back. Alright, the question says that the Coca-Cola price is now at $16. It may be a 10-pack price. And we can see that $16 obviously is not the equilibrium price. At $16, such a high price, the amount willing and able to be afforded by consumers is pretty low at 2, while the amount supplied is very high at 8. There is a surplus of 6, and the price ought to decrease to an equilibrium at 10 and a quantity of 5. Another one. Here is the demand and supply. The D1 and the D2 don't necessarily happen in time order. Neither do S1 and S2. Please pause and come back. Alright, this question tests the knowledge point of determinants for demand and supply and how the change influences the market equilibrium. We're at X, the crossing point of D2 and S1. Point W is a crossing point of D2 and S2. We can see that the demand does not change. We glide along the same demand curve. Supply shifts to right-hand side. We need a determinant change that increases supply. Option A, input price increases, is a negative shock to production. It increases the cost of production, decreases supply. Option B is the demand shifter that increases demand. Option C says that producers expect the price decrease in future, the producers would like to sell more now at a relatively higher price. Therefore, this is the positive shock of supply, increase supply and shift it right-hand side. C is the right one. Option D is a complex case that increase demand and decrease supply, but we know that demand shouldn't change, so D is not the right one. Third one, pause and come back. Alright, this one tests determinants again. It says that we're at Y. Crossing point of D1 and S1. Then there is a decrease in the number of buyers. That is negative shock on demand. Demand should decrease and shift left-hand side to D2. Nothing changes the supply, so the new equilibrium is a crossing point of D2 and S1, which is X. Did you pick the correct one? Last one, pause and come back. Alright, this one also tests the determinants and it's a complex situation. We originally is at W. Crossing over D2 and S2. If the new equilibrium is Y, then it's crossing of D1 and S1. So D2 increases and shift right-hand side to D1, and S2 decreases and shift left-hand side to S1. So we need to look for an option with a combination of determinants that increase demand and decrease supply. Option A is supply shifter only, that decreases supply, does not do anything to demand. The same is true to option D, which increases supply and does nothing to demand. Option C is a demand shifter that increases consumption but does nothing to supply. What about option B? If price of the product increase in future, consumers would like to avoid paying higher price in future. If they can, they move up the consumption to now. So demand increases now. For producers, they like to sell at a higher price. They postpone the supply to future, then current supply decrease. Therefore, option B provides the combination that increase demand and decrease supply. B as boy is the correct one. Did you pick the right option? Alright, that's all I have for this video. I will cover the situations when government set prices in next lecture. Thank you for watching. Please like and share the video and subscribe my channel for more lectures in economics.